That's something I wanted to bring up on the lion and the fox separate. I just started thinking, how does the lion go wrong and how does the fox go wrong? And it seems to me a lion is a despot, a fox is a deceitful person.
Well, a fox, it's been very interesting. Ezra Klein, who is, reliably, let's say, on the left in the American political spectrum, works for the New York Times. He and Derek Thompson, who works for the Atlantic, also reliably on the left. But I think both of them, I'm going to say this and I'm going to get criticized for it. I think both of them pretty intelligent, sharp guys. They've just co-written a book called Abundance. And part of YouTube right now, Ezra Klein has all sorts of things out where he's basically saying, why haven't the foxes been able to build anything? And actually, that's what the video that I dropped this morning and a little bit of I posted one on Voices Len, and I also made a Substack on this. What Ezra Klein says, the reason they can't resolve the housing crisis of San Francisco is you have all of these communities that aren't really communities, but the foxes are trying to manage these sort of blobbish things like the Black community or the gay community, and they're not really communities. They're just sort of these, he doesn't say it this way, these imaginary entities out in the world. And so you can't build an apartment building in San Francisco to resolve the housing crisis because, you're going to kill some worms, and the worm community is going to be very upset with you. And so there's a paralysis that comes with foxes that I think part of the reason people sort of instinctively, and I think the desire for Trump was deeply instinctive on the part of many people, was that enough of the managerialism, enough of the, we've got to hear everybody in the room, someone make a decision. And that's sort of the lion fox dynamic. But of course, the opposite of that is that the lions, they don't care about who they run over, or who they killed or whose blood they shed. They have a mission to attend to.
Well, Paul, have you thought about what Jesus called Herod? I mean, Jesus.
Herod was a fox, right?
Right.
Well,
and yet we would think of him as very much a lion.
We would.
But Jesus saw him as which makes foxes are a pretty dark figure. I mean, in your paradigm.
Yeah.
Well, I think he called him a fox because he was trying to negotiate between his Jewish, sort of semi-Jewish heritage and the Romans. He was trying to, where am I safest kind of thing,
Yep. And Herod was a master at that. The Herods they were political survivors. I mean, Herod, in a time when you back the wrong horse in terms of the Caesar horse race, that would mean death. I mean, Herod reliably jumps from, Mark Antony to Octavius. That's Herod the Great. And his sons and grandsons, sort of had that same, they were consummate politicians.
Well, even to be a child or grandchild of Herod was to be a survivor.
Right, you survived that lottery. No, that's right. Jesus calls him a fox. And he was also, another symbol of Herod was the reed. Because, of course, he couldn't put his face on there. Well, what does a reed do? A reed is always bending no matter what the winds say. A lion is like, I'm big and bold and kill me if you can. Sometimes they die.
Yeah.
Except Aslan, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what makes this so tricky, because that's where Lewis went. But of course, part of what you have to deal with, again, in the biblical corpus is you've got Jesus in the gospel, and, their followers are begging him, James and John's mom, let my sons be your lieutenants. And Jesus says, can they drink from the cup I'm about to drink? But yet in the book of Revelation, the vision opens with this incredible Christ who has his tongue as a two-edged sword, and he's got the 7 stars in his hand. And there's the lion. But and Revelation, I can't believe Jordan Peterson's going to play with this book. It's like, oh, Jordan, you have no idea what you're getting into. Because, you hear the lion and see the lamb, if I have that straight. It's the book of Revelation is just, it's just an astounding book. But if you're going to be, let's say, a biblical Christian, you've got to deal with the book of Revelation, which means you have to deal with the Old Testament.
Could what? I realize this is could be touchy, but is Ark possibly a Herodian type of Fox project? Because it is going to Jesus and trying to pull Jesus in and use Jesus to its purposes for a civilizational project that is ultimately about power and influence.
I think, Mark, what's worth considering, and then to use the example of Jesus that Paul just outlined there, is you've got the spectrum from the lion to the lamb, and there's different steps and milestones along that path. And like we have now endured, well, I mean, civilizationally, we've been stuck in books and, left brain thinking for a long time, right? So we've become more and more structured and regimented, and it's like, this is not in a manual, therefore how can I do it, right? And as that has progressed, and I've seen that myself, in various places I've been, where there's a kind of a move towards, it's not written down. Where'd you get the authority to do that? And where I'm going with this is that, so where am I going with this? Like, imagine the context of a civilization which has become so bounded by social media and other ways of communicating that it has slid from the extreme line of like a Napoleon, or to break all the eggs and to do what you want, and has gone all the way over and become neutered. So what does the path of moving back towards a healthy lion fox dynamic look like? And I think in the sense that Ark is an attempt to not flip to the extreme, but to try to reassert or reassess what does a post purely fox neutered society look like, if that makes sense.
I don't think Ark knows what it is yet. It's very sort of discombobulated, but it's a forum, and I'm really glad that Jordan and Philippa Stroud and the others, have decided to play with it. I'm much more partial to playing with estuary. And estuary is deeply fox-like. It's little, it's nimble. You can come into an estuary and pitch anything. And my channel, I'm very fox-like. I tolerate more in the live stream than a lot of channels will, and I like it. But you've got to, in a sense, you've got to sort of be a confident fox if you want to get anything done. and I like, while I'm not a universalist, just so that classist doesn't come after me. No, it's also true I'm not. But there are these tensions in Calvinism around that. Neil or Len, you of course remember Neil Punt and his biblical universalism, some of the books that he wrote about that, another CRC minister, and trying to, because the truth is that one of the basic things that the Christian Reformed Church and other Christian traditions say is God is not something that we can finally capture with our paradigms or our systems. And so what that should lead us to is a degree of humility into the systems that we create and enforce on others. Where, in the Christian Reformed Church, we were probably way over on one side of what does it mean to be Christian Reformed can mean anything. And now we're sort of coming over to the other side. No, we're going to tighten this up and we're going to have it mean some things, and that's going to bring some loss. And so we're, I think, Jeremy, you're right. Jesus works this lion-lamb dichotomy, but that again gets into this really difficult thing of what kind of power does Jesus have? People want to bring Jesus into their anti-Roman or pro-Roman alliance based on the power that they see exhibited in him. But basically, when he shows that he will not be anybody's puppet, well, then, you're way too powerful to leave hanging around here. Let's get rid of you.
Mark, one of the things you said earlier was like, you might as well annoy everybody. And I think part of the way that like Jesus works, and especially in answering things, can be very, very annoying to the people who pray for it, you know.
Well, Amanda says here, does doormat Christianity have its place? And the difficulty is that you cannot divorce the crucifixion from the resurrection. In that Good Friday, Jesus looks like a doormat. My God, why are you forsaking me? And Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're due. But at the same time, in Luke, one of the thieves on the cross sees something by attending. And who would say to a man stripped naked, being mocked and brutalized on a cross, receive me into your kingdom? It's like, what kind of kingdom is that? But that's I think why, as Jordan Peterson says of the Christian story, that's why it's an archetypal story. It's a limit case. You can't get around it, because again, that same man then shows up, and as I mentioned before, you would think he would knock on Pilate's door and say, how do you like me now? Or Herod's door. But he doesn't. He doesn't feel the need to press the point in the way that it seemingly all of the Christian apologists wish he would have. And so there we get right into this puzzle of power, where you would think that the church that is, emptying hospitals and, healing autism and cancer and bipolar disorder and, all of this thing, that this church would sort of rule the world. But the church hasn't done that, and yet it's still all over the world. How does that work?
But if you talked about the resurrection, if you follow the story along, so if the resurrection were to be an act of power before the world would have known about it. Jesus would have gotten up from the grave and gone to Rome and said, "Hey, here I am. You thought you got me? No way." He, at most, according to Paul, is 500 people. Okay, I'm going to show myself to 500 people. And he says to them, go and make disciples of the nations. And he already told them what a disciple is, which is to take up your cross and follow me. In that sense, the resurrection is not the power play like we like to think it was. Suddenly I win, but yes, Paul says it is the new creation. It's what's going to happen, but not now.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jared.
Can I play on that a small bit?
Yeah, of course.
So, was that not the ultimate lion move, right? And remember, I'm seeing lion as not just being a binary, but as a range of lions, right? You can be a man, or a good man, or a bad man, or whatever, right? There's differentiations in how you can do it. So you can have a lion which brings everything crashing down, and a lion who, the example that jumped to my mind was the person who set up the National Health Service over in England, right? That was a person who broke the paradigm, who refused to play by the previous rules and transcended and created a new thing. What does when you say that Jesus doesn't seek to present to the world his display of authority? Well, that's what a fox would do, right? A fox would be like, well, now I'm going to invoke subsection 7 to be able to prove to you that you all made the bad call, and I'm actually I was the guy you should have hired, right? But a lion has already gone. A lion doesn't care to play the games of the to follow those rules, and in a sense, that's lion behavior, right? So it's playing.
It's so interesting how Jesus and so many of the stories. I was just watching Ross Douthat was doing yet another thing about his book, and he made the observation that part of what has shifted in our culture is people are more upset if their son or daughter marries someone of the different political party than, let's say, someone of a different religion, which just shows sort of the valence of these identities and these characteristics right now. Jesus, one of the observations I made a number of years ago was I was reading through the book of Acts because I was preaching on the book of Acts. It's one of the lovely things about being a preacher is a number of years ago, I decided when I preach series, I'm going to stick to one book for the most part, because you can get a sense of the author and where that book is going. And you see Paul of Tarsus holding the coats of those stoning Stephen, and the heavens open. And Luke portrays Stephen. And if you compare like Acts and Luke and Stephen and Jesus, Luke recycles a lot of the Jesus language on Stephen, which is an amazing thing. And the heavens open, and Stephen has a vision, and of course he's killed, and Paul's sitting there. And then you've got the road to Damascus where the heavens open again. And it's like, hey, Jesus, while you had the heavens open, and, if you could have just turned your gaze a degree or two to the left, why didn't you talk to the Paul guy then? Because all these people that he persecuted from between Stephen and Damascus, I'm sure their families would have really liked a little let up from the Saul of Tarsus persecution, but you wait. And that gets into, again, this I love that story that you told, Len, because the Holocaust is this sacred moment of the 20th century where, and I think Jordan Peterson has it right, when we go to Auschwitz, we shouldn't be, oh, those Germans are such horrible people. We should much more be affected by the idea that if I were a German and needed a job or was drafted into the army, would I have felt it fortunate to be in Auschwitz Guard instead of over on the Eastern Front? What would I have done given those circumstances? And so
there, but the grace of God go I.
That's right. And so you begin to see this look into reality of the power of God, that God, this is part of the reason I'm a Calvinist, God chooses to call Paul on the road to Damascus, and not while conveniently the gates of heaven are open and he can just, oh, Stephen, yeah, you're coming up, buddy. And by the way, Paul, you're on the wrong track. You're kicking against the goads. And so, but God works through these things somehow, and I believe reveals his glory. But how that relates to what we call power or causality, I don't know.
But Paul wouldn't have been Paul if he called him earlier.
Exactly. God used his rebellion to make exactly the tool he wanted from him. And Paul, a very, flawed tool in many respects. I often think, Mark, when I read different letters of Paul, that he's a little bipolar, because he walks into a town and he blows it up. He's so enthusiastic. And the next letter you get from him, he's like, all have abandoned me, and Lord, take away the thorn and the, the guy swings.
He's a fellow crazy man. Absolutely. I love Paul for that reason.
Hey, Jimmy, I'll give you a call right back.
One of the things that sort of, the way that we kind of see God working always sort of happens at the end of it, right? Like you kind of never know what the heck's going on. And so with Paul, like, it's like, why not before the road to Damascus rather than then, or like, and in Genesis, with Joseph, I think it was like, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And it's like, all of that only happens at the end. And it's always a little bit of a mystery why God chooses to work in those particular ways. But
we can also
usually
just take the Job view of how dare you question why God does something.
I tend to see it as, at the end of it, whenever I see how things turned out, I always kind of go, you know, I'm very happy with the way that I'm very satisfied with those things, right? Like at least in my life, I can't not speaking about like, oh boy, all those Jews that Paul persecuted died. I'm very happy about that. It's like in my particular life, the ways that things have gone wrong and God has used them for good. I always kind of think after looking at it retrospectively, after it seeing the way that it all plays out, I go, yeah, that was probably for the best right, that way. And so it's because of that I have the trust that when things aren't going well or when I can't see why God is choosing to use his power in the way that he is, I have that trust, that allegiance, which I don't actually think works in this sentence, that to the idea that God is using it for good, and that whatever happens when we see it in the other side, it'll be like, more glory to God for all that.
There's a nice play then on that story, Elliot, that was just discussed about Saul of Tarsus and Paul, and what you've just mentioned, because Saul of Tarsus was the camp guard, right? Saul of Tarsus made his choice. He had a clear agenda. He was doing it for that purpose, and at some point he had to flip. And it's nice to then think that, so for all of our false challenges and problems, that at least we haven't yet fallen to the same level as Saul of Tarsus, but could instead perhaps somewhat grandiosely rise to the same level of, I mean, that does seem a bit aspirational, of the Apostle Paul, right? So he's got the bottom and the height, right? It's a lovely counterexample.
Yeah.
Here's a
One of
Calvinist word. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
just very quickly, I think one of the really interesting things you mentioned in that bit there, Jer, was he made the decision. And I think one of the things we were speaking about earlier was sort of like this make a decision thing. And Mark, you mentioned it was like you have to be very careful when you make these decisions, because you never know what sort of influences and sort of what kind of things are happening up in here that influence those decisions. And I think sort of maybe looking at Paul's and Saul's story is that he made those decisions, and and even whether in spite of or through or somehow both of those things, God still manages to work things out together. And maybe those are sort of, it's kind of a wishy-washy kind of guardrail, because again, you kind of only know about that at the end. But like, we can have some kind of trust and allegiance in the idea that God is the guardrails against our own inhibitions.
Mhm.
Well, just the one thing I'm wondering about is the word elect. I've been playing with that a lot in my mind lately, and it's a very Calvinist word. I like that word.
Mhm.
But I don't. I more and more tend. It's not the elect, and it probably has something to do with what Jesus talked about: as narrow is the way and wide is the path to destruction, and few find it, and so on. And the elect, how are the elect made? And Paul, I look at Paul, and he's so all in when he does make. Whenever, I mean, we see him. He makes his conversion, and he is all in. I think that's what the elect look like. Stephen is the elect in that moment. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Imitating Jesus, and then the third elect kind of person I see in Scripture would be like the criminal on the cross beside Jesus. When you come into your kingdom, bring me along. Receive me too. And I think it's the people who've come to a point with that criminal. He's at the only reason he could see it was that he everything else in this world he'd given up. It's nothing left. Now he can see it. Stephen, he's taken hits from rocks. His death is imminent. He can see it. Paul, somehow he had something of a lifetime after it, but all the time kind of seeing it. That's what the elect looks like. And it's that complete emptying of a self. That's what it is to be elect, I think. I don't think it's necessarily about the who's saved and who's not saved and all that business. I think it's much more tricky.
It's like choosing.
Let me push back
Yes,
a little
please.
bit on the elect thing. Basically, I think you're right, but I think the elect are those who God calls to somehow work toward what God wants to do in the world. But the elect aren't. It's not just the moments when they're doing the right thing. They're elect when they're doing the wrong thing, like Abraham, David, and all the rest of them were screwed up mightily in lots of different ways, and yet they were also the elect.
I'm just wondering if it's to be the elect is what you aspire to be, or is it to be unlucky? You know, I mean, it's to be cursed as much as it is to be blessed.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's like you've been selected to undergo a radical perspectival shift, you know, and particularly in the case of Paul, it's so radical that he ends up, what the perspectival shift is, you know, excuse my French, but putting him on his ass on the ground, right? So he has to look up. It changes his dimension, and now he goes solely to the vertical, right?
It ain't necessarily going to be fun.
Yeah,
no, if you think about Paul's life coach, be like, you know, things are going pretty good with the whole persecuting Christian thing. You had a solid group there. This new strategy, you're going to go into these towns and you're going to preach that Jesus, and then what are they going to do to you then? Well, and then you just becoming a Christian was a terrible life strategy for Saul.
Blew up his dream board.
That's right.
But the other thing is, Paul was deeply committed to God and to God's way in the world. I mean, he would, you know, a fist pounding preacher of, you know, of a Pharisee. He was deeply committed to God. Nobody would question that.
So then the question is does God make a difference? Does God make a difference? Because in Saul's case, he was. The commitment to God is there really a difference between Saul and Paul before the encounter and after the encounter? I mean, there's obviously a difference, but in terms of his commitment, is there a difference?
He was still zealous.
He's still the whipsaw for the Jewish people at that time was God had radically changed course, evidently. That was pretty hard to catch up with, and I can understand that.
Because I mean, I go to a Church of Christ, and it's very, very Arminian and very much about the commitment, make that commitment to Christ and get the baptism and get saved. You got to get saved, and I'm not the decision. Paul had made his decision long before he ran into Jesus on the road to Damascus. It's not him who saved himself from himself. I mean, he had made his decision for God early in life, it sounds like, and was going straight to hell with it. I don't know. That may be too theologically problematic. I'm not sure if I see Paul cringing.
No. I'm looking at the clock, and so I'm gonna start the. We're gonna land the plane here, and then I'm gonna drop the link, which will let in a bunch of lions who don't like the lion fox thing. So takeaways from today's discussion. What did today's estuary conversation mean to you? What did you get out of it?
One, I'm thinking of changing one little viewpoint, and it has come down to the trust and belief thing. I used to always sort of state my, faith of why do you believe? Well, I just choose to believe. Well, now I think I might be switching the answer to why do you believe? Well, I trust in God.
All right, good.
I guess my takeaway is I'm just really happy to meet all you guys. It's always fun to meet people from all over. The Netherlands, an Irish guy in the Netherlands, and people have gone through different experiences in different churches. It's just marvelous. I appreciate it.
But
Len, I gotta get you. I gotta find ways to bring you along on some of my things, because my trips to Europe and my estuary work all over the U.S. and Canada. This is exactly what it's like, and this is. Yeah. I often think, of course, Len knew my father a little bit, at least. If my father were alive today, he would have loved this. This was This was so my father, just meeting all the different people. And, I'm watching the live chat go through, and we've got Secular Quranism, and we've got Mark Lefevre, and we've got Sherry, and we've got how many different crazy voices in the thing. But I enjoy it. I enjoy it.